So, hello everybody. You're all doing well with having your mute on. That's very helpful. So this is our Honors Presents with Professor Dennis Ake, and he's going to be talking about something called the fifth quadrant and kind of how science intersects with film and everything like that. And Professor Ake has produced and or directed both documentary and dramatic productions for Disney, Nat Geo, PBS, Lifetime, Outside Channel, History Channel, independent television service. So he's won over 100 awards for his productions, and he earned a PhD from Ohio State University with an advanced work in English and film. And he's a tenured professor at MSU, the former director of the School of Film and Photo at MSU, and he's the current director of the MFA in Science and Natural History Filmmaking. He serves as a senior executive producer of the three-time Webby-winning conservation website and podcast Terra, The Nature of Our World, and his most recent works were Unbranded and Charged, and both of those are on Amazon Prime. So please welcome Professor Dennis Ake.
Thank you. I appreciate the virtual applause. Okay, so as I was telling Kate, when we originally talked about this a few months ago, it was going to be more about sort of science filmmaking and the influences of more mainstream filmmaking. And because the pandemic occurred, and because I'm the head of the MFA, I thought it was a little bit, it'd be sort of odd if I didn't switch this a little bit. So we're still going to talk about the quadrants because that's true for all the different kinds of filmmaking, but we're going to sort of concentrate on how a lot of science information gets distorted through different perceptions. So, and I hope that'll be valuable. Here we go. So I also told her that I've never really done, I've obviously taught my classes this way, but I've never really done this kind of a lecture where I'd be like sitting down and looking at a camera for the whole thing. I did put a PowerPoint together, which I realized a lot of younger people think is kind of old fashioned, but it was either that or you having to look at me for an hour. So I figured, okay, we'll go with the PowerPoint. So, okay. So I'm going to share the screen here, which I hope everybody will see. Thing. So let's see what we got here. Oops, there we go. Okay. Okay. All right. So we'll just get started here, and I hope this will work. So let me talk before we get going. I'll be talking about the fifth quadrant. So virtual facts and real fictions. And the idea here is that how we communicate now, how science has developed up to this point, has really changed the way in which we evaluate information and media and many other things that we're dealing with. And we're seeing that right now every day. If you watch CNN or any news, I really don't watch Fox, so I don't know what's going on over there. I think they're in their own world, but so we'll talk about it. Now, this idea of quadrants, this is really a Hollywood thing, and I'll say that right off the bat. And this is how Hollywood talks about audiences, okay? So the first quadrant is male under 25. The second quadrant is females under 25. The third quadrant's male over 25. And the fourth quadrant is females over 25. Now, the first thing you're probably going to say is, that is a lot on both ends of their spectrum here. You know, why 25? It all has to do with economics. I don't know. But someone, you know, who's 25 is probably not watching the same films as somebody who's like 35, and they're not watching who's 75. And under 25, of course, they leave out the entire children's market. So, but this is how they talk about it. It designates really kinds of films, and even though it's based on demographics, it's really also based on economics. And by the way, we didn't mention this, but we're going to leave the questions till the end because I'm sharing the screen and I can't see the virtual hands go up. Um, so, for example, action adventure, which includes the superhero films like Marvel, usually attracts quadrant one. Rom-com supposedly attracts, these are all stereotypes, so you'll excuse me, but I'm just passing the information along. Quadrant two. Thrillers, depending on the kind of thriller, if they're horror, they usually will be like 1 and 2. If they're thrillers, they may be 3 or 1, 2, and 3. Political and dramas, generally, it's 3 and 4. Okay. And this is totally a way that Hollywood looks at it and not based on really anything other than box office. And it's kind of old box office is theatrical. So, for example, I was talking to Kate before everybody joined us about the Godfather films, and they would not normally be seen as quadrants 1 and 2 when they were released. Even though, I'm trying to remember, I think, yes, I was in quadrant 1 and 2 back when they were released, or quadrant 1. And, we all went to see it. So that any film that appeals across the board is, as you'll see on the bottom there, it's called a 4-quadrant film. Okay. Now, here's the problem, as you receive entertainment and information in different ways, and your identity is more than one characteristic of gender and age. Okay. And that is why these generalizations do not always hold. Your preferences are shaped by a lot of things, which we'll get to in a minute. This is also true when you look at where television has gone to. There's a book, which I did not put the title here, Ben Fritz's The Fight for Hollywood, which came out 2 years ago, which talks about how peak television actually is doing better than films are doing. And peak TV is things like Game of Thrones or Ozark or Fleabag or any of those things that usually are winning Emmys. Breaking Bad was peak TV. And before that, it used to be called niche TV. In other words, there were always certain shows that different quadrants wanted to look at. Even those shows, like Game of Thrones, was very much a 4-quadrant show. Okay. And that's where Hollywood always wants to go, because that's where, quite frankly, the money is going. We are in a period of change now where a lot of this is going to be obsolete. The theaters, as many of you know, are closed. A lot of them were deeply indebted before the pandemic happened. And there's a bit of history which I did not know before this, that the same thing happened during the flu epidemic in 1918. So in those days, most of the theaters were owned by individuals and, as they say, mom and pop stores. When the flu epidemic occurred, they did exactly what they're doing now. They shut everything down. And Adolf Zukor, who at the time was a mogul, he was in charge of a studio called Famous Players Lasky, which became Paramount, bought up all these theaters. And that became how many theaters many studios, wound up owning theaters as well as studios. In 1948, that was ended by what was called the consent decree. But slowly the studios brought lawsuits and whittled away against it. So it's a kind of interesting thing that now theaters may face another transformation. I don't think they're just going to disappear, but after this pandemic, I don't know how many people are going to want to go into a theater with several hundred strangers. And the same thing will be working with sporting events, I would think. Okay, so the 5th quadrant, as I'm defining it, is basically everybody, okay? Your diverse characteristics. It's what we call intersectionality. I don't know if you've had that term in any of your classes. And what it really is your individuality, okay? It is hard to define who you are as an individual because everyone is very different. It's hard to put into algorithms. If some of you are business people, obviously marketing does a lot of the same thing because everyone is a product of race, of class, of regionalism, of education, of professions, of age, of gender preferences. And it creates overlapping and interdependent systems of advantage, preferences, discrimination, and disadvantage. So there are pluses and minuses to this. On the one hand, it makes you much more interesting people. On the other hand, it may lead to discrimination against you. It may lead to hiring disadvantages and all those other things that sometimes are related to simply age and gender, but are much more complicated than the studios obviously kept in mind. This is a diagram that I found that basically shows all the different things. And you see it's more than what I even talked about. Occupation, education, age, geographic location, ability, aboriginality, meaning if you are a Native American or a Native Australian, or your income level, your race, your family status, you're an immigrant, what your heritage and your history is. So a lot of those things, all of them come into play in defining who you are, and are part of what makes each of you have your own individual fifth quadrant. This is Audre Law here, and she has a great quote. She was an activist and writer. There's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. So you can be an activist for economic issues, for gender issues, for race issues, and all at the same time. You don't just pick one and then the other. You are who you are, and this is how you are defined. And it also affects how you receive information. So it will define what you read, okay? It will define what you look at on Main Street media. Are you an HBO person? Are you a Hulu person? Do you, I don't know if any of you still do, watch broadcast television? Do you go to things like FX, you know? Do you watch Fox? Because despite the ownership, which is problematic, it has things like Family Guy and The Simpsons on it. So all of this will go. Online, obviously, has changed a lot of things. There was a famous film called Living Online about somebody who lived his entire life on it, and it actually drove him crazy. But all of us, especially now, we are living online, more or less all the time. We're teaching online. It is also how you restrict yourself to what you will look at. And of course, social media has changed things so that there's instantaneous heroes, instantaneous villains, things going viral has both a good and a negative meaning. So it's Facebook, it's Instagram, it's Snapchat, it's all sorts of things. There are so many different social medias that I didn't even want to list all of them. Some of you may be on LinkedIn already, and they are collecting incredible amounts of data about you. You probably wonder why when you buy something, all of a sudden you get a message like, hey, would you like to buy another 6 of these, or something like that. That's because, they don't just know where you live, they know what you like, and many, many other things about you. Oops, what happened here? Oops. Okay. Oops, sorry. Okay, there we go. All right. So fact and fiction factors. So this brings us to the whole point when we're talking about science and media about what to believe, okay? How do you know that something is true? And probably all of us are going through this right now. I was wondering, if I have groceries delivered, do I need to disinfect them? Because somebody may have been touching them who didn't have gloves on. If I go out, should I wear a mask? That was a big debate all over. How can I, what can I do or not do to avoid getting COVID-19? So it's not just this, but it's everything. When we believe about economic stimuluses, Is this bill going to help people? So there are four factors that really influence how people will assess information. And it will also influence how people will provide the information. And the four factors are ideology, technology, methodology, and functionality. So we'll go through some of this stuff. All right, so ideology and technology. Now, an ideology can be one of the most dangerous things that people can have, because the beliefs held often are held despite evidence and contradictory facts. Okay. It often leads people to see and hear only what they think should be rather than what actually is. And you find this very often, of course, in extreme members of political or religious groups. And ideologues almost always fail eventually because it is the opposite of pragmatism and problem solving. It's not, okay, what is the situation? Let me evaluate the facts and let me hear what the possible problems are. It's like, no, this is what we're going to do regardless. It is the right thing to do because we believe it's the right thing to do, not because it actually is or the true thing. Technology, which usually becomes a tool of both ideology and I guess anti-ideology or pragmatism, can be one of the most disruptive forces. That's why there have been so many revolutions, the Industrial Revolution, media revolution, cyber revolutions. Think about it. Trains, planes, and automobiles, besides being the title of a very, very funny John Candy and Steve Martin movie, transformed how everybody lived. So Montana was not really settled to a great extent until the trains got here. So the Intercontinental Railroad was put in 1859. I know we all like to think about the covered wagons and all this stuff, but really the European settlers did not come out here in great numbers until the train came, especially if you are from the High Line. That's where a lot of people were in a lot of ways scammed because it was very dry and arid up there. And they told everybody that it would be great farming. Planes clearly changed things. You could go, well, when the Concorde was flying, it's still one of the strangest things that it doesn't, you could get to Europe in something like 4 or 5 hours, okay, or even less. And automobiles, of course, changed everything. It was really primarily after World War II. Dwight Eisenhower, when he was a general, saw how the Autobahn worked in Germany. And when he came back and became president, he built the interstate highway system. So that's where the interstates come from. And he used, in order to make it a federal project, he said they need him for national defense because that's what happened in World War II for the Germans. And it also helped the Allies conquer Germany because of how well connected the country was. Obviously, he didn't say that in terms of somebody conquering the US, but it was a way that if we needed to mobilize people and machines, we'd be able to do that. So right now we are part of a great cyber technology that has been going on, really it's been going on for a very long time. Eisenhower actually, not Al Gore, Eisenhower actually is the one who signed the legislation that created the internet, which was originally for defense and research. And of course, it branched out after that. And really from the late 80s and early 90s on, has influenced almost everything we do. It affects all facets of society and transcends in a lot of ways many of the divisions in the quadrant. So even this meeting, even how we're responding to the pandemic. If this were 1918, we would all be in our houses and maybe we'd have telephones and maybe there'd be a radio, but that would be about it. Now we actually have other ways to see each other, to communicate with each other, have classes. And even though it does transcend many of those divisions, it also creates newer problems in terms of hate email or misinformation. So technology is um, always has pluses and minuses, and that's part of what has to be evaluated when you're looking at or moving forward in your great search for truth. Okay, so methodology. The methodology that is the most common, and I don't know how many of you are science majors or not, but is the scientific method. The idea of having a hypothesis, you experiment, you have data, you do analysis, you do a report. Usually there is a peer review, and that is supposed to allow other people who are specialists in your field to decide how good your analysis is, how good your research was were your methods proper, and so that you can report on the data. The real problem with traditional scientific method is if you do it properly, it takes time. It's not a quick turnaround. And the peer review is one of the longest periods of time that it takes because you have people who may be remotely familiar with your work, but they've never actually seen the details, and they may have to do research themselves. So this is the traditional scientific method. Thomas Kuhn, some of you may have studied this famous book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And this was where paradigms were created about how essentially we find knowledge. And when something happened, the paradigms shifted. And the revolutions that we mentioned earlier really are the initiating of the new paradigms. So with every revolution comes a different way of looking at data, looking at experimentation, and we'll talk about it in a couple minutes here. The basic ways up until the cyber revolution, you had the empirical way of doing things, which was actually testing it. You had scientific theory early before, or I should say right before computerization. You did have computational, okay? You've probably seen pictures of the old big mainframes that took up a room. I can remember them actually, maybe this is how old I'm getting. One of the first films I did when I was still in grad school had an electronic score to it. And in order to do that score, we needed a room filled with equipment. And at Ohio State, which was mentioned where I went, we had one of the innovators in computer graphics, Chuck Surrey, and I was running a film festival and I went to visit him, and he was sort of exiled off to the edges of the campus in this old building with his computers, because at the time, the arts community really didn't understand how important what he was doing. He then eventually got a contract to do the opening graphics for the NFL games and the Super Bowl, and that changed very quickly. So Kuhn, which was also one of his major contributions, was that he said that you need to include cultural and societal factors. In other words, parts of what we're talking about. In other words, the way people are going to look at data, are going to look at discoveries, will not be totally based purely on what the data is saying. They will interpret that data based on where they are coming from intellectually and culturally and emotionally very often. And very often through self-interest. In 2010, there's a very interesting book, which is actually a collection of essays that came out called The Fourth Paradigm, okay? And it was edited by Tony Hay and Kristen Michelle Toll and Stuart Tansley. These are all Silicon Valley people. And the book was dedicated to Jim Gray, who is a Microsoft, executive who went for a sail in San Francisco Bay and disappeared. Was never found again. So it sounds a little weird, but he was much loved and did a lot of work on what's called data-intensive scientific discovery. And this is where data science became very major. And science and computing made possible faster discoveries based on massive data. The old scientific method, as we said, was slow. This, in theory, you can use these high-speed computers. They can scan and find everybody's research and make conclusions or draw conclusions from them much faster than the old method. And actually, two of the authors of this book, two of the essays in here, were by Sergey Brin and his wife. And Sergey Brin was one of the founders of Google. And his wife now actually runs YouTube. And Brin has a hereditary disease, and they put themselves in competition with more traditional scientists to see if they could use the data science to get to the same conclusion or a better conclusion than they did in less time, which in fact they actually did. So this idea of using the tools of the cyber age has really changed a lot of what scientific filmmaking is doing. I'm sorry, not scientific filmmaking, scientific discovery. Okay. The other thing is functionality, where we get down to basically what works, the incentive to work. In other words, we want to solve problems and get things to happen. And war, unfortunately, brings faster innovations. So the whole way that wars were fought changed in World War I because they became mechanized. You had long range, that should be long range. I apologize for the misspelling there. Weapons, planes, and tanks. Okay. And penicillin, even though it wasn't discovered until 1928, actually grew out of World War I because they were trying to find ways to counter all the infections from all the horrible wounds that people were getting. World War I's been called the last war among gentlemen because it was so massively destructive. If any of you have seen 1917, they captured that, incredibly well, and what it was like being in the trenches and having, weaponry come and armaments coming at you from nowhere. And it was also the first war really that had planes involved. And penicillin was pushed because of the many deaths from infections. They were having more soldiers killed by infection than they were from actual injuries. The atom bomb. The atom bomb is one of the most incredible scientific discoveries, whatever your position is on terms of its morality or whether it should have been used. In 1939, Einstein signed a letter. He didn't actually write it, another physicist did. But he signed a letter to Roosevelt saying, if we don't develop the bomb, the Germans will, because Einstein, of course, had trained most of those physicists and knew all of them, even though he had to leave the country because he was Jewish. And it went from a theory to a destructive bomb in 2.5 years, which is really an incredible amount of time, which really shows I've always said that if you really, really want to do something and you'll put the resources behind it, you can do it. That's something to think about with things like cancer and other things that we still have not solved. The Cold War, the moon landing. Most of you are probably familiar that with the story that John F. Kennedy went to a press conference, excuse me, and without telling any of his staff or NASA, pledging to get to the moon by the end of the decade because the Russians were way ahead of us in the space program. Well, we did it, we did it in less than 10 years. And it really became, and I can remember that because I was a teenager, I can remember that it was really the Olympics of space. In other words, because we had this Cold War and we all were doing you've probably seen pictures of this, duck and cover drills in case we were attacked by Russia. You'd be in school and go under your desk. I think I was in 3rd grade and I asked my teacher, if the school blows up, how does hiding under my desk save me? And was told to please be quiet and get back under the desk. And so what Kennedy's brilliant thing was, it wasn't just sort of invoking the idea of a war. It was also turning it into almost an athletic competition, okay? Because we like sports, and this was it. This was on a big scale. We're going to the moon, and we did. And you see this in our current push for a vaccine for COVID-19. Now, it's not as well coordinated. There are other issues here which we will not get into. I'm sure you're hearing more about them every day. But there are groups of scientists all over the world trying to figure out both a vaccine and possibly if there's some kind of cure and a more reliable test. So we see some of that same push, and that is part of why people are using the war metaphors, and why President Trump has invoked some of the war legislation in order to do things like to convert over factories and to give assistance to people. Okay, now here's the real problem. So you have those four things, right? And the problem with scientific method, and it's not really a problem, you could say it's a weakness, is that sometimes the method can be turned on itself. There's a great book that we used to use all the time in the MFA called Merchants of Doubt, okay, by Naomi Oreskes and Eric M. Conway, okay? And most of it is about how scientists obscured the truth about the dangers of tobacco for a very long time, and how other scientists were used to essentially become global climate change deniers, all right? And the weakness results from the fact that the very need to analyze data and draw conclusions can be used to undermine the research for economic and political purposes. Because remember, everybody's part of the fifth quadrant, and how you respond to things are influenced by multiple factors, including your economic status, including how you were brought up, and your political beliefs. I worked actually at a high-tech company right after graduate school called Chemical Abstract Service. And what they did there, they did not make chemicals. I was their one and only filmmaker, I think. I was in the marketing department. But what they did was all the research. I don't know if there are any chemists attending here, but chemists to this day still have to learn how to search chemical abstracts. It's called CAS now. Anyway, they had 250 chemists with PhDs in chemistry and chemical engineering, and they would spend all day abstracting all the research that would come into this 100-acre campus in Columbus, Ohio. And the head of the IT department one day gave this talk to the marketing department, because we had to work together, even though we were totally temperamentally and by training very, very different. He made a comment that I thought was very perceptive, and he had done a lot of IT work. Data does not lie, but it can mislead depending on how you interpret it. So you can take the same set of facts and sometimes come to two different conclusions, depending on how you're interpreting them, how you question how the data was gathered. There's a lot of variance there. And so we saw this, and this is part of Oreskes and Conway's argument, is that they got scientists, not always the scientists in the right fields, to oppose any government legislation or any change in tobacco, because tobacco was a big business. And of course, as we all know, climate change is a threat to a number of industries, including oil and gas. And right now, of course, one of the things to watch is we have a second crisis going on, that the oil and gas industry is plummeting because of a disagreement between Russia and Saudi Arabia. And on the other hand, everyone is talking about how, well, people aren't driving everywhere. They're not out in the streets. They're not burning fuel. And so the air is cleaner. The fields are cleaner. and some of the effects of climate change are being reduced. So it's a very interesting way of looking at things, and something to keep in mind. So the method was used against it. A famous case was Linus Pauling, as some of you may know. Linus Pauling was a great scientist, but he was not a medical physician. He wasn't a biochemist. He was a chemist, and he advocated the great use of vitamin C essentially to cure everything, even though there wasn't a lot of data. This is a scientist, wasn't a lot of data in it. Linus Pauling has 2 Nobel Prizes, one in chemistry and one in peace, because he was also a peace activist. I think Linus Pauling was absolutely well-meaning, because he really had no economic vested interest in vitamin C, but I think it's a way of looking at a distortion of the scientific method. Stem cells. There was a lot of, these are, we call stem cells vaccinations and climate change over in science and natural history filmmaking, the poster children of bad science communication, because the discussions got hijacked by people who had other agendas. So stem cells became part of the right to life movement, or the anti-abortion movement, because some stem cells were harvested from aborted fetuses. Now, not all of them. I actually did a film about bone marrow transplants, and a lot of stem cells were actually harvested from the patients and were put back in after they were treated. But the minute it became identified with stem cells, it became very emotional. And emotion, as we'll discuss in a little bit, is one of the most powerful ways of persuading people. Vaccination. Some of you may remember when there was an article by a British scientist that said vaccinations cause autism, okay? Even though there wasn't a lot of evidence for it. He eventually backed off from it because there were problems with it. But if you're a parent, I don't know if any of you are parents, but I am, and I'm a grandparent now. Anything that could be a threat to your child makes you very fearful. And you clearly do not want to be responsible for doing something that will hurt your child or your grandchild later on. So we still have it now, as they call them, the anti-vaxxers. And it's caused problems. There are diseases that, like I had when I was a child, which was a long time ago, that were eradicated that are coming back. Measles, chickenpox. These were all, like, by the time I was like 10 or 11, we all sort of had gotten it. But our younger brothers and sisters did not get them because they had had a vaccine. And polio is the same way. On the polio vaccine, which was both vaccinations and oral, basically eradicated polio. When people stopped getting vaccinated, it is now starting to come back again. And of course, climate change, which unfortunately got tagged as global warming and an inconvenient truth. But the point is that I'm actually working on a film related to climate change right now. And the fact is, people knew about climate change all the way back to the Kennedy administration. Okay, there were warnings that were going on, and by the 1980s, there were very serious warnings about what would happen. And of course, now we see the effects. If for those of you who are native Montanans, you probably hear from your parents and grandparents that the winters are much milder than they used to be. I can remember I came here in '89 and it was 40 below for 3 months in the winter. I started in January. We have not had a winter like that again. This has also led to a lot of conspiracy theories. You know, oh, somebody's doing this or somebody's hoarding that, or, you know, why are there so many, you know, things in some places and not in others? And we've just got a demonstration of this with the hydroxychloroquine arguments that have been going on, with some people saying, yes, it can be used. It is, I had to take malaria. I don't have malaria, but I did a shoot in some countries where we had to take the medicine. And that medicine is incredibly toxic if you don't take it right. we had all these rules about taking the medicine, when to do it, how much to take. And usually the doctors are not alarmist, but it was like, just make sure you don't mess up your regimen because it can have very bad effects. And I don't know if any of you have had any experience with malaria, um, but it's a very strong drug. And just because it treats some of the symptoms of COVID-19 doesn't mean that it should be used. Okay. And so what you have, and you see this on CNN Daily, is the battle of the experts, right? So you'll have somebody, usually from the administration, arguing one way, and then you'll have some other physician coming battling the other way. The thing is, as we learn from the fentanyl drug addiction problems, many of these drugs need to be treated very, very carefully, or they can do a tremendous amount of harm. And that's not necessarily a result of your quadrant 5 factors. That's just a result of common sense and of where the science is. However, when the people are arguing in favor of one of these things, they will very often speak as if they have done all the scientific research. Okay, so as Kuhn pointed out, what this really means is you have to keep your perspective. It is all really perspective. In the current pandemic, for example, scientists are foregoing formal publication to talk directly with one another to more immediately share research. Some of you may be in the sciences. This is really highly unusual because really most discoveries are not announced until they've gone through peer review and been published. But now there are reports of scientists in different countries, in France, in the US, in Canada, and everywhere. Not China so much because they're under restrictions, but even in China, to talk to each other and see what they're discovering, because each group is getting more patients all the time. It is part of the war mentality. It's like, we have to find a solution here. Functionality needs to come above some of these other things. And so they're going to more immediately share their research. In Colombia, in the country, Colombia, an effort that began before the pandemic to create inexpensive ventilators has taken on new energy. So our idea of a war is being used in both a metaphorical and a legal way to combat a disease and not other people, although there will be disagreements. So where is the truth? You know, when you see two people arguing about whether we should wear masks or not, you know, and all this stuff. So as I said, we're all members of the fifth quadrant, and we all have strengths and weaknesses because of it. One of the best advice I have heard lately is from, there was an article by Aisha S. Ahmed, who's a Canadian professor. And very often things happen that change the world forever. And you have to be aware of that. So she's warned against thinking we'll return to normal. She has been through wars in the Middle East. She's been through Ebola scares in Africa, not scares, epidemics. And you have to always seek the new normal. You can't really go back. And so, for example, 9/11, you were all very young, but that changed a lot of things. It changed how we traveled. Believe it or not, we never had security at airports. You never had to take your shoes off. You just walked to the plane, you know. You used to be able to have people come and say goodbye to you. It was like being at a dock for a boat. All of that changed. And now that's the new normal, okay? Security precautions. And there will be a new normal after whenever we can all come out of our houses, you know? And we're not sure what that's going to be. And you have to remember the perspective. The world is one big debate club now, both because of the technology. Some of you, if you're in debating, know, and I don't mean the debate club really in a bad way. It's like you have to really have evidence and know how to argue your points. And just like in the high school debate club, this is a very important thing. And the way that you are able to argue is to try to see the other person's perspective. This is one of the great strengths that universities will have. In other words, it's not just one perspective. It's to basically, as they used to say, get in someone else's shoes, see where their perspective is, and learn how to argue either for or against it if you don't agree with it. Not just, oh, you're stupid or you're this, or call somebody a name. It's like, there are errors in your reasoning, and here's what they are, you know. And also remember that all sorts of that science is not immune to fear and economic self-interest. Fear is often lurking behind a lot of justifications. And I've been through a lot of things where people were fearful, assassinations and the Vietnam War and the Afghanistan War and all sorts of other things. When Franklin Roosevelt said we had nothing to fear but fear itself, he just really nailed it. What right now is we are sort of capitalizing on the fear for a good purpose, to keep people healthy, to keep them inside. Okay, but that fear can also be exploited and can also prevent us from seeing, like, why did we have so much trouble responding to this crisis, to this pandemic? Why are we the richest country in the world, still the most powerful country in the world, can't treat our people? Why we have a hospital system that's falling apart? And that's where you need a little scientific method to go in and say, what exactly happened here? And try to be aware that not everything may have an economic benefit, but it may have a human and humane purpose. And so it's also not just seeing what works, but why did it work? Okay. You go back and see. So when I mentioned that thing about the theaters, to go back to the film stuff, in the 1918 influenza epidemic, it is because the historian went back to see, well, what exactly happened here during that period? And so if you keep in mind how the science method works, how it can be distorted, and also supported by the factors that I talked about, and especially through media, then you'll be closer to understanding and finding, where exactly that truth is. Okay. So let me this. Uh-oh, what happened here? I got lost. Um, did you come back? Okay, I have to come back. Oops, here we go.
Are you trying to disconnect your screen?
No, I was trying to unshare it. It says I have one meeting in progress,
Oh,
so you can start or join a new meeting. So I don't know what happened there. What I may have to do is leave and just come back in. Okay. So
sure, yeah, that
I
can
will, I will, I will return. Okay. So,
okay.
okay. So let me get out of that. Oh, here we go. I see what happened. Let's get rid of the sharing.
This is a good time.
I think I'm back. Here I am.
Questions?
There I am. I'm back. Yes, now I'm time for the questions. There's quite a
Okay.
lot. That was kind of a big information download, but try to give you your money's worth. So
Yeah. If anybody, feel free to just go ahead and unmute yourself. Uh-oh, Atticus, I don't think we can hear you.
yeah, I think she's still muted.
Atticus, you might have problems with your sound system. For some reason. Do you want to if you type it out in the chat part?
Oh yeah. Why don't you do it in the chat, Atticus? Because I think you can hear us, but we can't hear you.
Yeah.
This is just a good reason not to have too much faith in technology.
Yeah. Um, okay, there we go.
Oh, there it is. Okay. Oh, sure. Okay. So the film is called Youth versus Gov. Okay. And it's directed by Christy Cooper, and I'm one of the producers along with Olivia Hanneman and Liz Smith. And both Christy and Liz are graduates of the NFA. And what it is there is before Greta, okay, before Greta, 21 American young people who are around your guys' age, although some of them are much younger, there are a couple of 11-year-olds and in it too, sued the federal government on an argument of a public trust argument that the Constitution requires that the federal government protect the environment for future generations. And it's been having it's a very interesting lawsuit. It really started under the Obama administration and has continued against the Trump administration. It has been through several courts. There was a period of time where they were winning in the state courts, including Montana, believe it or not. And but now they're getting into the federal courts, and the Trump administration is taking a very, very hard line on it and keeps using a lot of legal maneuvering and everything else to prevent it. So there was a ruling that just came down from the circuit court. It's being appealed, so we don't know when exactly it's going to be done. The film has to be done by the end of August, so it will probably be released probably early. And now, of course, we don't know because the whole film industry is like in turmoil, but it'll probably be released in early, I would guess, 2021. Um, and we're in the rough cut stage, but I was very excited when I saw the rough cut. So we have two great editors, Lyman Smith and Tony Hale, and all of the plaintiffs have been impacted by climate change. They're from different parts of the country, ranging from the Navajo Reservation to southern Louisiana to southern Florida, and Oregon, and everywhere else. So yeah, so that's the film. There is a website. I think if you just look up Youth versus Gov, YVG, or just Youth versus Gov, you'll be able to find it. Okay. Thank you for the question. I'm sorry we can't hear you. So.
I have a question for you,
Yes.
Mr. Egg. What are the changes? You mentioned that obviously nothing's going to be the same after this. We won't go to
Right.
normals. But what do you think will be, if you can anticipate any specific changes? And would you be interested in making movies about those changes that you see?
Oh, that's a very good question. That's a very good question. It's really hard to tell because I think, and I'm not trying to evade an answer, it really depends how long this goes on. Okay. So the predictions I'm hearing is, I think Fauci said it today, I think, is that this won't be over till the end of May, probably. Okay. Um, and it won't be over either. It'll just be less virulent. Okay. And I think a lot will depend if we can get the testing up to where it should be, because a lot of this would be avoided if somebody wasn't feeling well. If you just tested everybody, you'd know who was in danger. But because some people are asymptomatic, it's a big problem. So you could
Right.
be carrying it around and you don't know. I think it's going to be a while before people are going to be comfortable about going into, public gatherings with like thousands of people. I think, everyone talks about how the real winner here is the NFL because they're not playing and, it wiped out, basketball season. It's going to wipe out, the baseball season, but it's not really true, because I don't think the NFL, I think it will help their broadcast thing. People want to stay home and watch it, which they do a lot anyway. But I don't know whether you're going to want to be with thousands of people that you don't know their medical histories.
That's a good point. Yeah.
And so I think it's going to take what we haven't had so far is real coordinated effort to see how we can allow people to gather again in some significant numbers. Are you really going to want to go into a crowded bar on a Friday night, when maybe half the people are carrying it? And the other thing with this disease, which is very scary, is there are all these people dying from it, a significant number, and there are also people who are recovering, and you can never tell. They have guidelines, like if you're over a certain age, or if you have a medical condition. But there are people, there are young people. There are more young people than they've talked about. People between the ages of 20 and 40 are getting ill, and some of them are dying. And it'll be very interesting to see what that data is like. And of course, it's skewed a little because they had, sort of assisted living facilities and senior citizen homes, and it just raced through there because everybody is together, and a lot of these people can't move. So,
Right.
so let me put it this way: if we needed a prediction, it's sort of like, I made that allusion to 9/11. Okay, so the thing is, it's going to be kind of like the airport everywhere,
Okay.
except not necessarily that we have to go through security everywhere, but that we are going to be a lot more careful about how we gather. If we are going to have a bunch of people, there may be some kind of test they're going to have to take, um, because some of you may know is that the way this disease works is there is the main contagion, and then it goes into remission for a while, and then it comes back, which happened in Singapore, which they think is happening in China, although they confirmed that yet. So
Huh. That's interesting. Any other questions from the group? Just go ahead and unmute yourself.
yeah, it can be about movies. It can be about I talked about anything. So
If no, I also had another question for you. Um,
okay,
so we got the Renaissance after the bubonic plague. What do you think we're going to get out of this creatively, out of
that's a
coronavirus?
very good question. I do, you know, it is somebody's theory, and I can't remember off the top of that. When these upheavals happen, the plague, wars, and everything, there is this kind of people get so low that they then want to get high again. That's that kind of thing.
Right.
Because there's so much loss of life and everything else. And I think we will have a creative high after this. Especially if it lasts, like even if it lasts to the end of the year. Um, and it's happening already. I have it with my students. The VCB, our building is locked down. Okay, they can't get gear, they can't go in, they can't edit. So really, a couple of hours before we met, I was with my second year grad students trying to figure out how they're going to finish their movies. Okay,
Yeah.
and they're being very creative about it. Two of the students, unfortunately, their films really they can't make them. You know, because they can't get to talk to people or get to travel to where they have to go. So one is doing a film on sort of the insects and bacteria in her house. Okay, that this is like do you know what's living here with me? That kind of thing. And the other one is going to do a thing with a lot of zooming and skyping of how us all being essentially quarantined is affecting relationships and just interactions.
Yeah.
Right, having to do everything on screens. So
That's pretty
I
creative,
think,
actually.
and that's just in in one class, and that's happening across the board. And I'm sure it's happening in the art department, and it's going to happen in the sciences too. There's a whole thing about how people are going to do their field work
Oh,
if this doesn't lift by the time of the summer. So, you know,
yeah. That's a great point.
and there will probably be a lot of movies about it, fiction films. But I have no
Yeah.
idea. Yeah.
Yeah, it's probably
The
true.
question will be like, we all lived through it, although people lived through World War II and still wanted to see the movies. So, you know,
Yeah, yeah. I just feel bad for all the people who have to read the college essays of all the people
yeah,
about how we survived COVID-19.
right, exactly. So any other questions? Anybody? Um, guess not. Maybe not.
All
Maybe
right.
everybody's burned out from.
Yeah.
It does happen, screen fatigue. I don't know how. People have had classes all day. So
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's fair. Well, thank you so much for doing this. I know it was very unconventional, so thank you for your time.
thank you, and thanks for inviting me, even though you invited me before this happened. But I'm glad we were able to still do it. So,
Yeah, me too.
and if
Thank you so
anybody has, and by the way, if anybody has questions, afterwards that you want to send to me, it's just daig@montana.edu. So feel free to send me, any questions that you have. Okay.
Perfect.
Stay
Well, thank
well,
you so
everybody,
much.
and safe.
Yeah.
Take care.
Bye.